Okay guys, so let's talk about experiments. If you listen to the interview video, experiments are on the opposite end. If interviews are all about getting to know the reasons behind why somebody does, interviews are actually all about action and behavior. You want to see what is the action and test behavior. But they are terrible for finding out why people did what they did. When you try to add interview questions to an experiment, you usually extend the time, and it can be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. So I'm going to ask you not to bother too much with adding too many interview questions into your experiment, but rather just focus on looking at action and behavior. So if you have a how or a what research question, then experiment is the way to go, because when you look at how questions, hows are asking about action. How do you take notes? That's an action. How do you study? That's an action. How do you look for sources? That's an action, right? So consistently how questions are about action. And so there's no point in sitting down and trying to interview somebody about an action. They often don't perceive their actions correctly. So you're just getting a very subjective answer. What you need is to test or see the action, and the experiment is the best way to do that. So what do good experiments do? Well, they account for every detail. The thing about experiments is that they're highly controlled tests. You're testing a situation. You're putting people into kind of your own kind of made up test of a behavior or a situation or a circumstance. So they have to be really, really controlled. Everything matters, and you'd be surprised. But let's say you try to do your experiment, and your experiment is, I want to see how well students read their secondary sources. And you set up that experiment to happen right after lunchtime. You're going to have a hard time getting them to read, and it has nothing to do with any other struggle, but the simple fact that they probably ate a big lunch and are going to be dragging through it. But wow, we never even considered that time of day might have an impact on the results of an experiment, but they do. So you have to consider everything from time, gender, who, their background. All of this will matter in the development of your experiment. So you want to take care of all of who are you going to be studying, how are you going to study them, what time of day will this experiment happen, what are all the little variables that could potentially impact the final results. You want to get all that down. Whatever instructions you create for the experiment, they have to be in order from the very first step to the very last step. You're creating a set of instructions or directions for yours. If you're going to do the experiment, it's step-by-step directions, step-by-step instructions. So make sure that they're in order. They need to be super clear, and make sure that they can be followed easily. So sometimes, you're the one creating the steps, and sometimes something that seems obvious to you isn't always obvious to another reader. So if you are doing the experiment, I would recommend get a family or a friend to read over your steps and potentially try to do it themselves or set it up themselves and watch, because you'll see where you missed a very important step or a very important part of the experiment, and then you can go in there and write it in. You also need to allow for some open-endedness, which is difficult when it comes to experiments because they're so controlled. But there are ways that you can allow for more gatherer-style experimenting. For example, you might want to make a lot of variables, offer to test or have quite a number of people in the experiment. That's going to allow for variation in final outcome. The more people you're testing, the more variation in the results, and maybe you're not just focused on one or two people because that's not representative of the whole. You're representing a much larger subset, and you can learn more from that. You might want to sit down, have a point in the experiment where you sit down and interview a few short important questions to get a sense of what's going on, why is the behavior potentially happening, if that matters to your research question. And consider, what are you having them interact with? What is the actual test that you're putting them through? Is it too closed off? Can you open up the test itself to different potential possibilities? For example, if you're only testing them on or putting them in an experiment with just one reading, is that realistic? Are there ways that maybe they can read multiple different readings, and maybe you can see changes and variations in their approach to multiple different readings or different kinds of things that you're testing? So you want to leave a little bit of flexibility in there, because too much control gets you very narrow results. So something to think about as you develop your experiments. Remember, if you're doing a how or a what question, you should most probably do experiments. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll get to you guys later.